Okay, well, live it says, but for some reason my picture is all screwed up. I don't know why that is, but I guess we'll figure it out. Anyway, welcome again to another session of Friends, Food, and Faith. We're here to discuss why the church believe in the assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So I thought it was rather fitting because, of course, this Friday we are celebrating the Assumption of Mary, and maybe go into a little bit of the background of how that came about, why it is that we profess that as a church, because some of our brothers and sisters of the denominations would not. They would say, nope, that is something made up. That is not. There's nothing about in history or in the Bible. We'll talk about that. That actually indicates that Mary was assumed into heaven, or doesn't say anything explicitly that happened. Well, to that last point, we would say, yeah, that actually is true. There's nothing in the Bible that says the Blessed Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, was actually assumed body and soul into heaven. But there are indications in Scripture and good reason why we would actually believe that. For instance, the scriptural base actually comes from Revelation 12. So in Revelation 12, this is island of Patmos, before he dies, because he was exiled for being a Christian. He's the only apostle that didn't die from martyrdom. He died of old age and probably exposure, but still, he was still persecuted and sent away from society because of his Christian belief. What happened with him was while he was on this island, that's weird. Why is the USCCB website not working? Oh, that's because I'm saying USSCB. It's USCCB for those who don't know. He had this vision, right, of Jesus coming to him, of interacting with him, and actually this vision of the New Jerusalem in heaven. And in Revelation 12, there's this vision of this woman who's with child that's giving birth, and Satan is getting ready to consume this child upon their birth. But of course, she's saved. She's lived there for about 3.5 years. Then she came back, and the dragon, the Satan, tried to her child, but she was saved again by these miraculous eagle wings and was preserved from this destruction. So we see some definite relationship between the Blessed Virgin and this woman in primarily the fact that she appeared in the sky, clothed in the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars. Now, what gives that good reverence is not necessarily something that was handed down by the apostles, not necessarily something that is taught definitively by the apostles. Well, I guess it would be in the fact that it is dogma, but also gives evidence in the fact that oftentimes when the Blessed Mother appears to people, she appears to people clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars. Many of the apparitions, whether miraculous medal, whether it be her appearance to the children of Fatima and Lourdes, at Guadalupe, it's another great example. She has this crown of 12 stars with this glowing aspect from behind her and standing on the moon. So, okay, even though those are not dogmatic, meaning one must believe that she appeared to these people, it gives good credence that the Blessed Mother and this woman are, if not the same, very similar. Because there's an argument made that when it comes to verse 2 of chapter 12, that she was with child and wailed aloud in pain as she labored to give birth.
So this, one of the mysteries of the Rosary is that really, really pretty part where she's clothed with the sun and the moon is under her feet and on her head is a crown of 12 stars. But when you read in Revelation, what goes on right after that is like some serious stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, so here's the main theological point that a lot of people would bring up against this, right? So if Mary is without original sin, has experienced, let's say, the preternatural gifts, the gifts that were given to Adam and Eve before the fall. If we recall from Genesis chapter 3, one of the punishments of the woman from the fall was what? Well, the way the scripture says it in English, and it's important to go back to the original translation, but primarily what it says is increased labor pains, like intense labor pains. So that raises a very interesting question. Was God's initial plan that there would be pain associated with birth, but maybe not a very bad pain, right, that comes with birth? I think that's open to interpretation. I think you could also say, was it God's plan that no pain would come from the childbirth? Because we would imagine that at Jesus' birth, well, there may not have been some pain, but because Mary was who she was, that pain would be significantly reduced, if anything, right? Which is why there's a lot of controversy sometimes with some of these depictions of the birth, that Mary's in these labor pains, she's screaming. Well, the best we would say is, well, maybe, right?
It's all a guess.
It is kind of a guess. I mean, so in other words, you could hold that maybe God's plan was to have no pain at labor, in which case this seems very interesting that this woman's in labor, right? Or having pains in labor. If that's the case, why would we say that? Well, we have to understand that Jesus' birth already occurred. It is occurring, it has occurred. And that was a, if not painless birth, a very reduced pain level. We would understand that the birth being given here is not of Jesus, it's of the church. And because the church is made up of fallen individuals and people that are not Jesus, there would be pain in that, right? If not physical pain, definitely pain of the soul, right? Which is what this is kind of getting at. So, in other words, just because she's in pain and labor doesn't mean it's not the Blessed Virgin, that she's not body and soul. For those of our brothers and sisters who would argue that, that would be how we respond. It's like, well, first off, Genesis doesn't say there would be no pain, any pain. But also, this woman seems very much in these revelations that happen over time after the death of the apostles in these appearances. So we would probably hold that that's the same person. And there's always been an association through time of Mary as a type of the church, right? So she's a kind of a symbol, an aspect of the church, right? The church, the bride of Christ, right? Right, Mother. Yeah, there's aspects of that we see in Revelation, but we wouldn't go as far as saying that's not Mary. Well, this still indicates that she's there, body, right? And even this aspect of her running into the desert, right, also is kind of indicative of the time when Mary and Jesus would also been in Egypt to escape the cruelty of Herod that brought about the Holy Innocents, right? And so if you add the time frame up, that we're actually in Egypt for about 7 years. Because if you add all these numbers up in Revelation, it's about 7 years, 3.5 and 3.5. Again, was it 7 years? We don't really know for sure, but there's some revelation and what was happening in the Gospels as well, which also gives it a 2. But primarily that we look at verse 14 to 15, given these 2 wings, that she would fly to her place in the desert where Pharaoh was taken care of for a year, 2 years and a half year. The serpent then left her. He left her alone. The person's not worth it. Now, that also indicates that actually is Mary too. Satan just doesn't give up on those that he can't, right? So because we're all fallen, we all submit to issues. Satan is pursuing us, not as much as very, very rigorously. And so the fact that he would give up on well, he can't win against her, which also indicates this is the same person. That this is a bodily person. This is a person with a body and a soul that is in this vision that's going on, right? That is the scriptural base that we have. But that's the scriptural basis we have for the Assumption of Mary. Because were there figures in the Old Testament in that? Yeah. Before Mary. That raises some very interesting questions because, well, wait a minute. If the go to heaven, and Jesus had to come then to bring people into heaven, right? Well, how are these Old Testament figures brought into heaven? They weren't without original sin. I mean, Moses in sin, and Elijah was conceived in sin.
These are guys that God came down and had conversation.
And so to that point,
And
right?
God does, or the Bible does
Right.
say that he was one of those meekest people.
Mhm. But he still sinned, right? He was
He
stoned
was
twice.
still with them.
Right, so yeah. But he was, like you were saying, though, he was conversing with God often. He would go into the Holy of Holies, where God was present. Is it possible that those sins were by God? Sure. Right? When he had that original sin from Moses. Sure.
Can we go as far as saying that Moses, Elijah, and these great men
Mm-hmm.
that we think were assumed had freedom to choose whether they wanted to do what God asked them to do or not, and they did. In that case, got to be like, you're my man.
Of course. They had free will, just like anybody. They're humans, right? They're not superhumans. They were humans. They had free will. They could choose. And we even see that, right? Elijah still sinned. Moses still sinned. Still sinned, right? Yeah.
Did the rock.
Yeah, the rock thing, right? Yeah. Hey, you tapped the rock. You don't supposed to do that. You know, whatever. You didn't follow what you do.
Right.
So, but also God, and we would trust that they were contrite, right? That God would forgive them. So, and the other evidence is that not only scripturally is it says explicitly that Elijah was the other fire chair came down, took him up. What's interesting though is what we know about Moses, because Moses, we're told, was buried in a ravine of Mount Nabor or Nabor. So we have a pretty good indication of where he's buried. Then we don't have his body. We can't find it. It's nowhere to be found. So that raises two other issues. Well, again, it's a question about really pertinent here, but it is an interesting question that's raised about, right? So it's evident that Mary is in heaven. She was greater than these other figures. She never sinned in her life. She went against that. So because these other figures of Elijah were assumed, and Enoch is very briefly mentioned, and his book is interesting. Whether it was actually written by him or not, nobody knows. But into heaven. So if they were, it would make sense. God
yeah.
that was born without original sin would also too, right?
You would sing it.
Like that. Dad humor. I mean, but it's also interesting because there. Now, for our conversation, it doesn't really matter. But there's two schools of thought that one can hold, that Mary did in fact die. That itself is called the Dormition of Mary, that started in the East. This record was actually probably like the 3rd century. It came more prevalent. It wasn't really celebrated. It was celebrated in the West, but the writings about it came in about the 7th century, right? So it started with the Eastern tradition. But there's, even in that time, there were several churches that were dedicated to the Assumption. This is an ancient thing that was practiced by the church, not only scriptural tradition in the practice, right? So there's always been this celebration of that she was brought body and soul in heaven. Maybe different times of the year, but there was still this recognition by bishops and priests. So there's tradition, there's scriptural reference of these things. Whether she died or not, Moses died, right? So there's at least some evidence of that. And if her son died, well, then the title that started in the East, the Dormition of Mary, it's an eternal sleep. So it seems like she did. The opposite, well, yeah, but Elijah didn't die. At least we didn't have indication that he died. Enoch, we don't know. There's all it said about Enoch is he walked with God, and the reference in the New Testament is this great righteous man. It would be greater glorification of God if Mary didn't die, right? That shows God's power, his might, his love. The Dormition doesn't necessarily indicate an eternal sleep. Sleeping, right? That her heart rate reduced and she actually was soon by herself. Doesn't really matter for our conversation. All of you have to believe that actually happens. body and soul in heaven. What's interesting, though, is does anyone know when this dogma was actually proclaimed as such? It is, and because, like you said, at least 1,800 years, if not more, there has been this tradition of the church of this celebration. In the liturgy, it's been brought up. It's been proclaimed and deacons. Dogma until November 1st, 1950. And this was done by Pius XII, who was the Pope at the time. He did it in his own office. Now, some would say this has been done by the Pope. The first one was actually by his predecessor, Pius IX, in 1854, with the proclamation of the Immaculate Conception. Again, was an ancient tradition of the church, always was there, whatever.
Right.
Argue, well, this is a very safe bet. But if you read the document that actually proclaimed this dogma, which was Munificentimus Deus, the most bountiful God. It always is the first few words of the document that actually gives us a name. And in it, Pius the 12th goes through this kind of history, this scriptural reference. Even after Vatican I, there was actually a push, and there were surveys put out, and there was these conferences made, and there were priests and bishops and deacons and even lay people, theologians. Do you proclaim that Mary is assumed body and soul? And unanimously, it always came back positive. That, but also this other things. Pius to make that a dogma. He made that a doctrine of the church, a dogma of the church, on his own authority as the Pope, in the same authority that was proclaimed in Vatican I. Right? That's the big thing came up, that the Pope can make infallible doctrine and dogma on his own accord without the council or anything else. What's interesting, though, is that he talked to the ordinary magisterium and made this on his own accord. So, in a nutshell, that's kind of why not only do we have the reference, we have this tradition, this living history that actually occurred, and probably the biggest source of evidence that we have is that we don't have a body for Mary.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church, one thing that we're really big on, where people are buried, their body parts, venerating them, right? And so if we have, the thumbnail, if we had the entire body of the Blessed Virgin Mary, we probably would actually keep that and venerate it and make sure that we knew where it was. But the thing is, we don't, right? Relic. We have no body part. Well, I shouldn't say we have no relic. There are certain relics out there that are considered maybe the veil of the Blessed Virgin Mary, but we don't actually have, let's say, first-class relics that actually are part of her body, right? Which you would imagine if we knew where she was, right? But we don't. And so for those reasons, we would say, yeah, it seems that it was God's will, and it makes sense knowing it was or is her mission, her role, and the gifts that God gave her even before she was born. The original sin thing, right? So there's also a definitive that some of the figures in the Gospels themselves also were without original sin, not conceived that way, but born that way. For instance, Thomas that held that St. John the Baptist was born without original sin, not conceived with original sin, but born. And the reason being is because at the visitation, when he leaped in the womb at the presence of Jesus, that thought that Joseph was also cleansed of original sin. He passed because of his role and his love and his presence of God, right? One can make that argument for anyone that came in contact with Jesus. So cool, right? And we would say that, well, these people, maybe not assume, but brought the original sin, it also makes sense that Mary would be, but also even more so in the fact that she was, and that was an act purely by God, and no, right. So, questions, comments, concerns, heresies regarding this aspect. I imagine you probably maybe you already knew this. I don't know, but I mean, I think it's a conversation to have because we may experience people in our families, on the street, in our homes, that would be like, "Oh, you Catholics, this whole Mary." Well, hopefully, we have some ammunition and go into like, well, yeah, biblically, Moses got these rationales and these traditions that were held, and especially for someone who holds sola scriptura, I think the scriptural arguments are even more, because they wouldn't necessarily care that we had a mass back to the 2nd century celebrated the Assumption of Mary, even though that's really significant, right? But to each their own, I suppose. Good.
It only makes sense to me that she would be assumed.
Mhm.
Like you were saying, all the major players, right? God's mom,
Yeah.
and nobody.
Right. Well, and I
So the
think
nobody and God's mom was. I've never really, even when I was a little boy, I would have always thought she just got taken up to heaven.
Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, and that's actually kind of interesting to think about that. Like, there's people that have memory of the fact that was not Asian, right? It would have been, but even before this happened, there would be no solemnity. It was this high mass, low mass, whatever. But yeah, that's kind of interesting to think about. This is relatively new in the life of the church. It's also ancient, which also makes a lot of sense when we think about the church itself. That she's always new, but also always ancient. The relationship with the church is always present there too. Yeah, I mean, the other thing too is I think it's understandable about this relationship with Immaculate Conception, because again, that's gifts, and one of the effects of sin would have been death, right? So again, back to this whole like death discussion. It's also indicative that Mary maybe didn't die because she suffered from original sin and the effects of that. Even decomposition of the body is somewhat of a punishment, right? And she would not experience that, which gives you more. She's not on this earth.
Who was so the difference of the words ascended and assumed?
Yeah.
Is that ascend is under your own power?
Correct. Yeah. So heaven, because he's the only one who can do that, right? It's his own power. There's some argument in theological circles that can only be done by God, but that God, or was that actually an act of God the Son? I think it really matters because we're talking about the Trinity here. That's mysterious. That it's what the way God works, what He does, it's beyond my understanding anyway. So whether God the Father bringing the Son back or the Son doing it on His own authority, who cares?
Well, once he died, he wouldn't have been human anymore.
Right.
He would have been divine. So,
No, hold on now,
so he
because Jesus also had a human soul that would never have left him. So yeah, you wouldn't have a human body at that point. His body was in the tomb. Soul. And so whether his divine soul in heaven was
what happened to that then?
human, it went into hell with his divine nature that brought the Old Testament figures out of hell, right, or Sheol. But the human soul and his divine nature that we believe was never separated. That was always, they were always together. How they are or how that looks like, that I don't have an answer for. No one really has an answer for. It's right. Yeah, exactly. That is the nature of the hypostatic union, that are not separate. They're not like half human, God, completely human, completely God in this one known as Jesus. The hypostatic union, that's all the same, right? So in respect of the ascension, yeah, God did it. God did it on his own power, whether it was God the Father bringing. Either way, only God can do that. Right? So only God can bring someone into heaven, body and soul. And they can't do that on their own. He can do it on his own power. Elijah can do it on his own power. Mary, that can only be an act of God. Yeah. So that's a good distinction to make. Right? Because even though Jesus' body, who knows countless how many bodies in heaven? We don't really know that, right? Because we do know that our body would be resurrected because it's happened. And Jesus promised that. Just united and in heaven, ours will be too. Over time in heaven, whatever that means, simultaneously, we don't know. We don't know, right? Again, these are mysterious things that we don't have any experience of. So I'll be surprised, I'm sure. Right. Mhm.
I don't think we'll care.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's very true. I mean, because
We'll be very happy.
when you're in the presence of God face to face for all eternity,
That's all that matters.
that's all that matters, right? Right. We hear that in the multiple attendance, 6 a.m. and noon. Hey, like you're getting the same reward.
Yeah.
It's all going to be good. It's actually more than you deserve and more than really you can even imagine. So.
Thank you, Father.
Oh, good. Yeah. Any questions? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and break. See if anyone's streaming. That's weird. I don't know why that. Looks like it still went through, so that's fine. Well, see everyone next week for Bother the Father. So bring your questions, and we'll go from there.